video, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Because for anyone that doesn't know, I'm huge into photography and video. I love that stuff. It's fun. I love it. It's good. And for anyone else that's interested in that stuff, I want to teach you some things that maybe you don't know, or maybe entertain you in some way. Anyways, in this video, what we're going to be doing, this is going to be more for the beginners for photography, for someone that's maybe just bought a DSLR or looking to get into it, or maybe has one and you're always shooting in an automatic and you want to learn more, to get into that manual setting, switch it over, and have a little bit more control over your pictures. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the big three things that you need to know when it comes to photography. That is going to be ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Alright, so let's start off with shutter speed. So shutter speed, the best way to explain it, so with cameras, with a camera, you're going to have your sensor inside the camera, and then there's the shutter. And the shutter is essentially like a door that like kind of lifts and closes, or opens and closes, whatever. And the shutter speed is how long that door is up. When you're taking a picture, and let's say you have your shutter speed set to like 1 second, that is pretty long, so something more at nighttime. But anyways, the door would be open essentially, so the shutter would be open for 1 second. That is letting light in, that's letting things get onto the sensor to capture that picture. So if it's a second, that is going to be brighter than if it's, 1/800th of a second. So the time that you would want to use faster things is more like daylight, and you're trying to let maybe less light in to touch that sensor so that your picture isn't overexposed. If it's nighttime, you usually want to have it open a little bit longer. But another thing to to think about when you're doing shutter speed is anything moving? Because if something's moving and that shutter is open, it is going to be capturing from the time it's over here all the way through to however long it's open. So if, let's say you're taking a picture, you're at like a soccer game, a kid's soccer game or something like that. You're trying to take a picture of your kid running across the field and it's open for a second, you're going to have a second worth of that kid that starts over here moving all the way through. So it's going to kind of give it this weird blurred out effect. It looks weird. I don't know if I'd even call it an effect. It's more of a mistake. So that's when you'd want to have something really fast so that it can open and close right away and capture exactly like that point of when that kid is running through the field, if it's a soccer game. So now I would only recommend doing pictures at a kid's soccer game if you have a child. If you don't, you might look a little creepy just taking pictures. So just a little tip. So anyways, moving on to aperture. The best way to think of that is it really depends. Aperture changes depending on the lens. It's not something so much that the camera does. It's more based off the lens. So different lenses that you have different apertures. They can go as low as like 1.2, 1.4 usually, up to, most lenses go up to like 24, 30, something like that. And how that works is, so let's say it's at 1.8. Think of it as being like an eye. So think of the aperture as being like a pupil. So when it's really dark and you're in somewhere that's dark, your pupil gets really big, and it does that to let more light in. So when it's big, it lets more light in, and then when it's really bright out, it gets smaller, and that would, let less light in. So just so you know, a little biology lesson for you too. Anyways, why that's relevant is because if it's at a, let's say, aperture 1.8, like a 1.8 f-stop, again, there's different ways of saying it, so if your aperture is set to 1.8, then it is going to be really big. When it's really big, it's letting more light onto the sensor, and then it's also going to, there's another thing to look at and think about, which I'll tell you in a second here. And then when the aperture number is really big, so like let's say you're at like an aperture of 22, it gets really small. It's kind of opposite. It's kind of confusing when you're learning, because the big number means a little aperture, and then the small number means a bigger aperture. So it's kind of weird, it's confusing, I know, but you'll figure it out. But the other thing to look at aperture is it controls the depth of field. So it's not only controlling how big it is, it's also the depth of field. And what that means is essentially if you're at a 1.8, it focuses on a very narrow point away from the camera. So, let's say let's say you're taking a picture of me right now. Let's say you were here with me, and you take a picture, it's at 1.8. Let's say my eye is in focus, and that would be like a very narrow depth of field. So you'd pretty much only have like this plane along my body in focus, and then anything in front of this or behind my eye will be out of focus. Now if you switch that from an f1.8 to let's say 16 or something like that, it takes just that eye in focus and it kind of stretches out that depth. So now anything, let's say in this range, is in focus, and anything in front or behind my hand right now would be out of focus. So why that's important: if you're taking portraits and you want the background to be super blurred out, have that nice bokeh effect, then you'd want to have it on a really low aperture, maybe a 1.8, 2, 2.5, whatever. I guess it depends on what the subject's doing. If you are taking a picture that you want everything to be in focus, let's say it's a landscape, let's say it's someone in front of a landscape, in front of a mountain, the Eiffel Tower, whatever it is, and you want everything to be in focus, that is when you're going to want to increase the number of your aperture, making it smaller, which lets less light in, and that's maybe when you'd want to do the other thing that you're kind of maybe figuring out, and increase the shutter speed, or lower the shutter speed, make it longer. So just to review the aperture, what that is again, think of it like a pupil, right? 1.8, really big. 22, really small. 22, lots in focus. 1.8, not much in focus. So yeah. Anyways, moving on to the third thing that you'll be controlling would be ISO. ISO. I call it ISO. Sometimes I hear ISO. I just call it ISO. It's what I'd recommend, personally. Alright, how should I explain ISO? This one's a little bit more confusing to explain, although kind of not. But let's let Google tell us, and then I'll translate it because it's probably going to be a little confusing. So, what is ISO?
According to Wikipedia, film speed is the measure of a photographic film's sensitivity to light, determined by sensitometry and measured on various numerical scales, the most recent being the ISO system. A closely related ISO system is used to describe the relationship between exposure and output image lightness in digital cameras.
1 second, I'm still chewing. I thought that would be longer. Okay, 1 second. That was not the best explanation. She was right, but it's a little confusing. I'll dumb it down a little bit. I'm not calling you dumb. Anyways, so ISO is essentially the sensitivity of the sensor. So again, we got the sensor, we got the shutter. They don't look like this, but we got the sensor, we got the shutter. The shutter opens, and then there's the aperture that widens, closes, right? Okay. And then the ISO is something that more that the sensor does, or how your camera processes the light hitting it. If you have a ISO of 100, that is the darkest for the most part that a camera will go, which is usually what you want to do. Usually when you're taking a picture, you want to leave the ISO as low as you can. The reason why is because when you increase that ISO from 100 to, let's say, 3000 or 1000, whatever, it can start to get grainy. So that's when a lot of the time, like if you're taking a picture with your phone at night and it looks like crap and it's really grainy and the color's off and everything's like brown and like gray for some reason, that's because of the ISO. So that's because the ISO in your phone is being cranked to the max so that you can actually see what's in that picture. And it's the same with cameras. Cameras do it better than a phone does because it's a larger sensor, but either way, when you increase the ISO, let's say you're taking a picture of here, right? Back there, and I turn all these lights off. Maybe I leave one of them on because it'll be really dark. And then I crank up the ISO so that I can actually see what's in this picture. It's going to be really grainy. There's going to be a lot of noise. It's not going to look good. What I want to do, if I was to do this situation, is make the aperture as big as possible, set it to 1.8, 1.4, whatever you got, and then put it on a tripod so that it's still, and then increase or lower the shutter speed. Set it so that it's like maybe 2 seconds or something like that, 3 seconds. Again, it kind of depends on how bright or dark it is. So one thing about shutter speed, I'm just gonna go back a little bit, is if you are, let's say, taking this picture for 3 seconds and you're holding it, chances are you're not that still. So chances are you're at least a little shaky, maybe not full, but chances are you move a little bit in 3 seconds. And again, if you're moving at all, or anything is moving in the subject and you're capturing it for a long time, then you're gonna get this weird dragged out picture. It's just gonna look weird, right? So that's why you want it on a tripod if you're doing something longer. Just throwing that in there. Little bonus tip on top of the soccer kids. Just throwing tips at you here. Anyways, back to ISO, because that's this part of this video. if you can, leave it at 100, if possible. If you are to the point where like you can't move your aperture any larger and you don't want to raise or make the shutter speed any longer, then you should increase the ISO. I usually don't go above 800. With my camera that I have now, I can go a lot more than 800, probably 1600 before I even start to see any grain. But I just like to leave it at 100. I personally don't like grain in my pictures. Some people do. Some people always just crank up the grain on purpose when they're editing. It's not my style. I like things smooth. But anyways, guys, thanks so much for watching this video. Thanks for sticking around to the end. And yeah, feel free if you want to, if it's something you're into, go ahead and click that subscribe button down there. Just go spank it a little if that's something you're into. And anyways, guys, thanks again, and enjoy your next video. If that's something you're doing, enjoy scrolling the gram today if that's something you do. And anyways, see you guys.